Welcome back to the Data Driven Strength Podcast. My name is Josh Pelland. I'm here with my co-host, partner, collaborator, Zach Robinson. This is episode 65. I think it's going to be hard. This is going to be a hard one to follow up the previous episode is going to be a hard one to follow up. I thought that was might be top 5 all time. What do you think?
Yeah, you were pretty juiced about that one. I thought it was good. I think I haven't done as much of the really deep thinking on that topic as you have, and I think that probably left me trying to follow you most of the time, whereas you maybe were dreading through new ground.
Do you listen to the podcast?
Occasionally I do, particularly for audio checks, as we hopefully listeners can attest that our audio is progressively getting better. It's always a hard thing to listen to your own voice, but I definitely have to do it occasionally for just making sure our audio doesn't sound absolutely terrible. Apologies for the podcast with Greg Knuckles. I got multiple DMs about how much that was just absolutely ear shredding, and dearest apologies, but we're working on it.
Yeah, once I see you publish an episode, because somehow that's kind of fallen onto your plate. Once I see that you've published an episode, I usually check out the audio because it's always kind of something we're chasing our tail with. And then I usually just end up listening to the whole thing. And I listened back to that one a couple hours ago, and thought it's kind of weird to compliment our own podcast, but I thought that was a good episode, and hopefully everyone enjoyed it as well. Today could potentially be seen as a follow-up to that episode. I'll kick it over to Zach here in a second to lead it, but basically what we're going to be discussing is how that dose-response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, again, probably kind of constraining things to hypertrophy this episode as well, just like we did last time, how that might change based on training status. There's probably some insights in the research that we can gain, but there are probably limited insights from the research that we can gain. So hopefully that's a decent framing, and Zach, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll kind of give my framing for why I thought this would be a good follow-up. So ultimately, the thing we kind of touched on last time was going through the maintenance volume research, and ultimately how we are probably considerably less confident in that than we were once upon a time. But hopefully gave some pretty useful kind of heuristics that we kind of view things with now. But that conversation had me, thinking through kind of this other general heuristics I have with respect to volume, and kind of these other corners of the dose response relationship. So, obviously in the kind of the center of the kind of mental model, you have just like the general dose response relationships between volume and hypertrophy, volume and strength, etc. But then you kind of, you take the main trunk of the tree and you kind of go out to all these ancillary different branches that have, maybe not as wide of an application necessarily, because they're things we're less confident in because they're harder to study, etc. But, they still have pretty meaningful practical implications. So maintenance is an obvious example there. We talked about not only does that have, directly important implications for a lot of different things. You think of periodization strategies, injury concerns, lack of time availability, specialization. Like there's so many different ways that that's applicable. But another one of these branches I kind of started thinking about was just how people view this dose response relationship and how it kind of changes over time. I could go on kind of like a historical diatribe here for a while. I'll spare that, but ultimately, I think you can get pretty compelling arguments in both different directions. And I think I've been on both sides of this as well. So I'll briefly kind of touch on what I mean here. So let's just, for sake of argument and sake of simplicity, to kind of think about this for this episode, let's consider there's a linear relationship between volume and hypertrophy. So the more volume you do, within reasonable limits, like let's just say 30 sets a week, just to give it some numbers, you're going to get more hypertrophy per set or in aggregate. Now, as you advance or as the individual gets more trained, I think there are reasonable arguments to say that that dose response relationship necessitates a trained individual either trains with higher or lower volumes than they used to be able to continue to see progress. So one argument may be, as someone gets more trained, they need higher volumes to see any progress in the first place. So you may be able to maintain or see like minimum effective dose type gains with 5 sets, and now that becomes 10 sets. Alternatively, someone may say that the trained individual, they get stronger, they get more efficient, their training skill improves, their proximity to failure awareness improves, all these other things that kind of are more training quality, I guess is just the easiest way to say it. All of that stuff kind of improves, and the absolute amount of stress that they're able to put on their body is potentially going to outpace their, the fact that they're a bigger overall human. Like it's a disproportionate relationship there potentially. And so it's because of that, some would say that you actually need to perform less volume as you advance because of all these other things. And so I just started kind of re-examining my position on those kind of things. And obviously the podcast, like we said, is a really good grounds to kind of talk shop about this stuff and kind of go through some of those premises, some of those underlying presuppositions potentially. And I guess I thought about this through the perspective of like 2 different avatars. So kind of trying to solve this issue. The first is someone who wants to continue making any progress. So if I'm an individual and I don't really care about optimizing things, but I just want to make progress, I want to continue making some forward steps with respect to hypertrophy, how does that dose response relationship look for them and the testable implications on ultimately, versus someone who wants to optimize progress. So in the first example, that's more so looking for, does the actual nature of the dose response relationship change such that a given amount of volume that used to result in progress no longer does in either direction. Whereas the person optimizing progress, what would need to change there is that the dose response relationship would need to change so much that a once volume that was optimizing progress no longer does so. So just again, to put numbers on it, if there's a linear relationship between volume and hypertrophy, 30 sets is going to optimize their outcomes in theory. But if that turns into an inverted U as you advance, 30 is now going to result in considerably worse outcomes than maybe a more moderate training volume. That's different than just shifting the amount of gains that you get over time from a given amount of training volume. Let's say 30 sets resulted in 10 units of growth. Now it only results in 5, but 30 is still better than 15. That's the kind of the distinction that I'm hopefully trying to paint here. I don't know if anything's unclear there before we kind of go through some stuff.
I think as we discuss this, what makes the most sense in my mind is to make it clear when we're discussing things from a muscle-centric perspective versus a practical perspective. Because I think there are some limiters that could create kind of a practical inverted U where additional workload does, again, from a practical sense, have kind of downstream effects, which ultimately decrease the muscle growth. But that could be completely independent from a muscle-centric perspective. So I personally think that kind of causes some differing anecdotes or differing perspectives for this question of how volume needs change over a lifting career. Again, sometimes it's more practical things. And it's, I guess, as a bit of a spoiler, in my perspective, it's probably less of a true muscle-centric change, at least on the like rightward end of that dose response curve. So at higher volumes.
Go ahead and give a practical example of that just to nail that home for somebody who's listening.
A practical example of practical constraints.
Yeah, like practical versus muscle-centric constraints. It doesn't even have to be like what you actually believe, but just like a very easy to understand to make the distinction between those 2 things clear.
Yeah, so if I were to do 100 sets per week for chest training, probably no matter what exercises I choose, I'm going to experience some some sort of ache or pain, if not, outright injury, that's going to require me to pull back the dosage, or require me to not train with the same level of intent, focus, whatever the case may be, kind of creating this practical inverted U. Whereas in actuality, if we were to just like theoretically apply 100 sets of stimulus to the site that you're measuring with an ultrasound, that actual dose response relationship, I'm not saying it isn't an inverted U at the extremes, but who's to say, right? Is that really how the body seems to adapt to higher and higher dosages of various stimuli? I don't really think so. I think it's more of a practical consideration. So the most obvious example is injury.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that between the training stimulus and the receiving muscle of that training stimulus, there's ultimately this kind of window that you have to pass through, which is all these logistical things related to tolerance, which ultimately is going to come down to the perception of the training stimulus of a human. So that's going to be things like aches, things like pains, things like lack of motivation, things like lack of effort, all those kind of things that in theory are obviously very important to take into account when you're creating a training intervention and you're kind of thinking about a training program in general. But at the end of the day, those are separate than from what if we were able to basically hook somebody's pec up to maybe like electrical stimulation or maybe even something different than that, where we were able to deliver the training stimulus without having it necessarily to be performed by a brain, essentially. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would classify it as like indirect negative effects. Um, so yeah, I think that's a pretty fair characterization.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so what I was thinking mostly for the conversation is to keep it in the realm of that kind of muscle centric view. So let's make the assumption that the thing that's holding this person back in terms of their progression isn't one of these ancillary kind of situations. So, for example, here's an easy one. Let's say you take somebody who doesn't have very good training skill or doesn't really understand how to push themselves appropriately, maybe doesn't choose very good exercises, their technique's really sloppy. They just don't really have the basic understanding of how to make a set really high quality. They may start off their training career being able to quote unquote train with 50 sets per muscle group per week, but in reality that isn't the actual like quote unquote stimulus they're receiving. So as they advance, as their training skill gets way better, as their points of execution improve, all these kind of things, their optimal volume may be considerably less than what it once was, but the actual training volume that they were actually applying to their muscles in the initial example may not have actually been the equivalent to like 50 sets, if that makes sense. So that's an example where I think like you said, the bias of like what should trained lifters do with their training volume gets kind of murky, because depending on where you start, where you finish could be either an increase or decrease, even though maybe the same underlying physiological construct is applying in both cases, but it's harder to see relative to what you're actually performing in the gym. So hopefully that makes sense. Does that example kind of track?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, a set is a gross metric, right? Um, like up to this point, the meta-analyses we have on volume only quantify a set as a set, no matter whether it was like the primary force generator or whether it was a synergist. So an easy example is like the biceps in a row. A curl in a row would count as one set for the biceps. That's more of an extreme example of what you're getting at, but ultimately, what we care about here is like just this theoretical concept of stimulus. So I guess what I'm hearing from your end is the what we kind of want to talk about is the muscle-centric dose response curve of additional stimulus, not necessarily of sets per week, because sets per week kind of it's a shifting goalpost as someone gets better and better at training.
Perfect way to frame it. Yep, I like that. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to ask you the question, and then we'll kind of go through our intuitions, and maybe we can ask each other questions. So ultimately, Josh, if you take somebody who maybe, let's say they got the basic kind of training skills under their belt, maybe training for 2 to 4 years, something like that, and they, kind of profile their volume needs at that point in time. They train for, let's say, an additional 8 years, and then you're going to profile their volume needs again. Where does your intuition lead you to the progression of those kind of needs to make any progress, and then the needs to optimize progress for that individual, and then we can kind of go back and forth.
One more time on where they started.
Sure. So let's just say it's an individual that's been training for 2 to 4 years. I'm avoiding giving you specific numbers to see if that factors into your answer ultimately.
2 to 4 years, and then you said 6 months later.
8 years. 8 years later.
8 years. Okay, dude. Yeah. You definitely said these things. I'll be honest, and you can leave this in without editing it. My dog is squeezing her toy, and I was distracting me. But hopefully my mic didn't pick it up. So someone that's been training for 2 to 4 years, and then 8 years later, how do their general, maybe I'll just say recommended volume, how does that change?
Yeah. So what is the volume necessary to make any progress, and the volume necessary to optimize progress? How do those two things change?
My intuition is that that kind of intermediate phase, in my experience, seems to be where you can get away with kind of the highest dosages. Kind of the way that I've thought about it is, when someone starts training, they don't need a whole lot of work because they're a noob, whatever, right? But then as they kind of adapt to the training and they don't get completely wrecked from, any given session, maybe the first, 2 to 3 years of lifting, that's when you can get away with some extreme stuff because your body's adapted, but you're also, not lifting the heaviest of loads. Maybe your training skill isn't all that great. Maybe you haven't gone down the fitness rabbit holes to really learn what it truly means to train to failure, et cetera, et cetera. But then once you kind of get that training skill, you can probably bring it down to kind of this quote unquote low to moderate range, and kind of see steady progress there. So to specifically answer your question, given this person is not a beginner, my kind of knee-jerk here, and I don't even think we can make an evidence-based answer to this. It's more of a evidence-informed,
100%.
Evidence-informed. What was it like for me? What was it like for you? What's it like for the clients we've worked with? And ultimately, it's an opinion. I would say that the volume required to progress in terms of sets per week is going to be pretty similar from, let's say, year 3 to year 10 or year 3 to year 11. In terms of the volumes in which you might see a practical turn for the inverted U, that might be a little bit sooner for the more advanced person because of that additional training skill, perhaps better ability to get closer to failure, heavier loads, that sort of thing. So I think the window gets smaller would be my answer, but that's primarily from the practical top end coming down.
Okay, so that's what I was going to ask. So it sounded like to me, the few kind of caveats that you mentioned, those sounded like kind of logistical constraints rather than muscle-centric constraints. Would you modify your answer for a muscle-centric perspective?
From a muscle-centric perspective, I don't think it changes all that much. Just you get less of a response at a given dosage. I think the kind of nature of the dose response is going to be pretty dang similar. And again, it's not that you inherently just respond better to high workloads from a muscle-centric perspective when you're an intermediate or a noob, but instead it's that you can kind of get away with it, right? But then later in a training career, some of those practical things might come into play. But as I say that out loud, man, sometimes it can be the opposite, because if you're, trying to squat, bench, and deadlift DUP 3 times a week for max hypertrophy in year 2, but then you get a little bit more creative or just smart with exercise selection in year 11, maybe the set volumes can go up. But as a general heuristic, I think, again, it's more of a practical thing. And I don't think the muscle-centric dose response curve is probably going to change all that much.
You stole a lot of my answer, but I'll hopefully give a little bit of a different perspective on a few of the things. So the first thing I think you said at the end there that I think is absolutely crucial to mention, and you kind of said it earlier in kind of one of your quotes, but a set is a pretty bad metric, I think, for this conversation in particular, because of all of these things that you mentioned that can change from a practical perspective. Inevitably, every single person, as you get more advanced, you just get better at training. So that makes this conversation so tricky, because from a practical perspective, your set volumes are probably going to come down as you advance. There's a lot of things that are causing that. Your training skills improving, your training time probably becomes more limited. The amount of time it requires to warm up for a given rep load combination is going to increase as you get stronger. There's just a bunch of different logistical things that kind of almost in a way necessitate lower set volumes. However, as Josh said, and I tend to agree, I think the muscle-centric kind of dose-response relationship is basically unaltered. The only thing that changes is the absolute amount of return that you get for a given amount of stimulus. That's going to change. And the reason that is potentially, to kind of take it to the other perspective and talk about why some people may think that they need even higher volumes to make progress, is because there's only a certain amount of adaptation or a certain amount of muscle growth that we can notice in a given amount of time, right? This is why we require special equipment in the lab to measure these things that people don't have access to in practice. And a question Josh and I have talked about a lot before that we just don't know is like, how much muscle does it take to make a meaningful difference in your strength, for example? Like we just don't have answers to those questions really. And so in this example, a lower amount of set volume may still allow you to take steps forward, but the amount of muscle that you're gaining may be so much smaller and so much attenuated compared to where it once was. Practically, you may not be able to observe it on a time scale that you're used to, which may lead you to intervening in the opposite direction. So I think both of these things can relate to both perspectives that people have. Is ultimately the people that come from the side of things that they find they need to slash their volumes as they get more advanced. They probably were doing way too much when they were early in their training careers. Probably were doing what I was doing in the gym, where on a chest day, I was doing literally every single exercise in the gym. And as I've gotten better at training, just exercise selection improves, effort improves, execution improves, all of these things. And you learn those things are motivated to improve your training skill even more, because your training time maybe is decreasing as you get more responsibilities, things like that. I think, my set volume is a fraction of what it used to be. But that said, it doesn't mean that if I wanted to go and try to break all-time PRs for strength numbers, now that I've kind of reset things to be at what I would say is a good baseline, now that the training quality is of a sufficient level, I would still expect that once I'm no longer able to notice progress in a kind of a reasonable amount of time, I might have to turn the dose up to make progress at a faster rate. And once again, that doesn't mean that training with lower volumes may not be allowing me to take steps forward, because I think it does. It's just that because as we advance, the absolute rate of adaptation maybe is decreasing, our ability to kind of notice those things is probably going to decrease a little bit. So I don't know what you think about that, Josh, that kind of general framing, but that was where my head went. It sounds like we converged on pretty much everything, just maybe a little bit different reasons why.
Yeah. One thing that seems kind of a loose end in my view is how the kind of like, I guess, minimum effective dose changes from a true untrained individual to year 3, for example. Because I think we both just hypothesized that from year 3 to year 10 or whatever, that's probably the absolute set volume is not going to change all that much in terms of that minimum effective dose, if we had to guess.
I think you have to define, so the thing that's challenging with minimum effective dose is we usually don't have to define the window of time that you're talking about, but I think that's crucial in this case. So let's say minimum effective dose means any muscle growth in X weeks. That to me is like the way, or the volume that allows to lead to an increase in muscle growth in X weeks. That would
So
be
in
like
an
the testicle implication in my mind, because if we're saying that lower volume still allow you to take steps forward, it just is at a much slower rate. That would be a necessary component to be able to evaluate that fully.
so in an untrained person, I think we'd agree that minimum effective dose is going to be like one weekly set. Um, in a So are you making the claim that in even a highly trained person, or let's just say someone in year 3, their minimum effective dose is also one set given enough time?
That's the thing I'm chewing on, and that's kind of what the maintenance volume discussion has been an
It's
interesting thing
definitely
for me to
not
think
one set
about.
every 6 months. So
Correct.
like there
Right.
has to be
Right.
the, but I guess you could say that about an untrained person too. Um,
Yeah.
right. Cause
It's
like
it's it's
an
tough, right?
untrained person will probably grow from one session, and like that probably still isn't detectable, but maybe an untrained person grows from 3 sessions, right? And you could detect that in a cohort of untrained folks. But a cohort of intermediates, you might not be able to detect that, but that doesn't mean it's not, like maybe it requires 20 sessions. And again, that still might mean there's an effective dose. I just I have a hard time buying that, to be honest. To me, kind of the baseline training required to maintain just it seems like that would have to go up once you become trained. Um, See our last episode for a whole discussion on the probably most useful maintenance volume studies. I guess like to give your point some backing is that like there are very few effects in the research in which maintenance volumes do lead to a decrease in muscle size. Or like when volume is reduced, it's very infrequent that when someone continues training, no matter how low a volume, that they see a loss in muscle size. And then I guess the question is, what if they just train at that much lower volume for another year? Then are they going to see like appreciable muscle size? Um, it's an interesting perspective. I've honestly not considered that. Um,
I think at the
yeah.
very least, I don't hold to that like implication necessarily super strongly. I guess the part of it that I am a little bit more confident in is that the other end of things from a muscle centric perspective probably doesn't dip all that much. I would say that I'm very open to the fact that like the lower end of what is going to result in any forward progress in a, a reasonable practical amount of time. And I guess maybe that's a better way to think about it. Is it like to some degree there's like a reasonable kind of practical limitation in terms of the timeline that we're looking at. So like I could say in concept that if you train for a year, one set could result in detectable growth, but like that's not what we're talking about. You know what I mean? So like in all actuality, when that rate is decreasing at a fixed time, it's essentially raising the minimum effective volume. Essentially, you can increase the window a little bit, and you'll have a little bit of wiggle room there to like make it so maybe it doesn't increase a ton. If you like account for the fact that this might take longer to see meaningful improvements, but like even within the range of like 6 months, I'm sure that it's going to go up a little bit to be able to make a meaningful judgment on making any progress at all. So I think when you look at it that perspective, it's like the minimum effective dose probably does arise a little bit, but it's hard to say why that's the case. And I would probably say that it shouldn't dissuade you from trying lower volumes if that's what is required. Given enough time, you may be able to make meaningful steps forward, even if you are training with pretty low volumes in that case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. One thing that I was just trying to pull up really quick is like just from all the data we've extracted from various projects, something that kind of stood out to me is how infrequent there are negative effects. Um, don't get me wrong, they definitely occur. But, measurement variability is a thing, sampling variability is a thing, et cetera. So um, that would be an interesting question, is like, given the density of negative effects we see in the research overall, what's the probability that um, any sort of training program could lead to a true effect that isn't a negative effect, right? So I guess, put more simply and less in like academic terms, would just be like, it very well might be that training grows muscle. Like, any training grows muscle, and all we're talking about is the rate of muscle growth. And then practically, as you get more advanced, that rate just decreases so much that you do need more dosage to see appreciable muscle growth in a given time period, whether that time period is 2 months or 2 years or a decade, right? That's definitely a possibility. I think, honestly, either way, like you said, from a practical perspective, that's not really what people mean when they ask this question. So, but I do think we're kind of converging on probably what's going to be the main takeaway of this episode, is that we're not aware of like a strong reason to believe that training status is going to truly influence like the nature of the muscle-centric dose response relationship to additional stimuli. But from practical reasons, kind of on the lower end, that practical reason is the rate at which you would reasonably expect to see progress. And then on the higher end, it's probably going to be some of those indirect practical consequences, whether that be injury, burnout, warm-up time, especially if you're more of like in the powerlifting type of training style, are going to kind of influence things on the upper end, especially as you get really strong. I think that's how I've conceptualized it recently, and I think this conversation added some color. Is that a fair synthesis?
Yeah, 100%. I think if I was to kind of put my synopsis on the conversation and as succinct as possible, is like the true relationship between volume and your gains probably doesn't change all that much, maybe a little bit, but not all that much. And so, from a troubleshooting perspective, it makes things relatively straightforward. But where things get much more complicated is when you have all these other factors that Josh mentioned: training skill, injury, burnout, all these other logistical considerations that are modifying the amount of stimulus that the number of sets that you're performing equates to. We think the stimulus, or the nature between the stimulus and your gains, is relatively straightforward for the most part. But the way that stimulus breaks out into the number of sets that you're performing, there's a lot of gray area, or a black box that has to go through to actually spit out a set number. So I think from a practical perspective, what I would encourage people to do is basically, as fast as possible, is try to get your training quality really, really high. And that makes navigating the dose response relationship when you hit a plateau, or you're looking for a rate of progress that's satisfactory to you, it just makes things a lot more straightforward. And I think that's something we've both learned from our coaching experience quite a bit. And at least I know I have, for sure. Is just, that is an absolute bedrock of when I start up with a new client, is like just making sure that everything is executed to the absolute highest quality, highest standard as humanly possible, because that makes the troubleshooting process on the latter half of the coaching relationship, as you inevitably hit a plateau, etc. It makes everything so much more straightforward, as opposed to what I used to do is really just go off of what was seeing, positive changes kind of no matter what, and using that as a reference to what everyone should be doing. So this is a little bit up in the clouds, and this is a longer conversation that we'll have eventually. But I think just thinking about like these higher level dose response relationships, and kind of trusting that that's the case for pretty much every situation, and then just navigating the logistical situation that you find yourself in. Somebody's somebody's execution, somebody's motivation, their training time, all these kind of things, and interfacing that on top of it to kind of find the direction you're supposed to go has just made things a whole lot more, intuitive and a whole lot simpler. And the foundation of that from a practical perspective, again, is just making sure training quality is really, really, really high. And then from there, you can navigate things a whole lot more straightforward, I guess, in my experience.
Yeah. And I think we've kind of seen like a big emphasis on exercise selection in the last few years. And I think I just think that's pretty damn essential, not only for hypertrophy outcomes, but also for strength athletes in terms of something we've talked about to some degree on the podcast, but honestly, we can and probably should talk about it more as addressing strength limiters. So trying to, it's kind of an old school idea, but I think there's I think it checks out intuitively, and my experience has been it's been a real game changer. Especially if someone has a clear muscular strength limiter and you can address that efficiently, that goes a long way as well. So I'd say that's probably, in the top 3 or top 5 things have changed over the last 2 or 3 years. Is just more and more emphasis on quality. Quality's kind of always been a point of emphasis, but within that is exercise selection. Okay, this is kind of a hard right turn back to this dose response question. Would it be fair to kind of sum up some of the practical things, again, less of a muscle-centric nature of the dose response relationship question, but more so from a practical perspective? The window of productive training volumes might shrink as you get more and more trained. And I'm not saying that, if you've been training for 30 years, you only have a range of plus or minus, 2 sets on either end to be productive. But maybe it goes from, hey, you could literally do 1 set per week, or you could do 30 sets per week as a noob. And you're probably going to see, really notable results, and kind of pick your poison based on your preferences and, I guess, any practical considerations at that point. But then later on in a training career, I've been training for 20 years. From a muscle-centric perspective, maybe 1 to 30 is still the true effect, but from a practical perspective, it's more like 8 to 20, right? In which you're going to fall to kind of see reliable results without some of those indirect negative consequences.
Yep. I think that's a very, very good way to think about it. Is, from a practical perspective, that window shrinks. But from a troubleshooting perspective, within that window, the directionality in which you would troubleshoot stays the same, is the way that I would think about it.
And to be clear, just because I feel like I have to say this, like, I'm not saying someone that's untrained should jump straight to 30 sets per week. I'm definitely not saying that. I'm just saying, like, theoretically from a muscle-centric perspective, and that is something that could be kind of worked up to relatively quickly for an untrained person. Another thing that I think is helpful in terms of takeaways for the listener here is zoom out, right? Because some of these practical things are real, like some of the practical factors that might make kind of this logistical inverted U relationship in which you shouldn't do additional volume. It's going to lead to worse results, but not because of a muscle-centric reason, but because of a practical reason. A lot of those things are just because it's going to take away from your longer-term ability to apply stimulus, right? If I try to push someone to bench 6 times a week that has no business benching 6 times a week, and then they have to take 3 months of rehab training or whatever, where they're doing effectively, no sets per week of productive bench press training or chest training, whatever, you've effectively decreased the stimulus under the curve over a long enough time period. So I think a lot of this could be even further simplified by thinking of training beyond what am I doing this week, and thinking of it more of what am I doing this quarter or this year, or honestly, in a lot of ways, I think in terms of training enjoyment as well, and having a good relationship with training, as up in the clouds that seems, kind of think of it in multiple years, and maybe even over the course of, a decade or a season of life, et cetera. So that's something I've just, emphasize more and more in how I conceptualize these things is zooming out.
Sweet. Yeah, I thought that was good. I'm sure we'll have more follow-ups to the training volume stuff. If it wasn't evident, we've both been thinking about this a lot for some of the projects we've been working on. So there'll be more to come, more offshoots, more branches of that main trunk. And then I'm sure there'll be more discussion on the trunk itself when the time is right. So thank you for joining us on another episode of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Be sure to continue to leave your comments and your questions on Q&A boxes on Instagram. We got some really, really good responses this week. So I'm excited to talk about some of those in a future episode. But make sure we can get your questions answered. And as always, leave us a 5-star rating and review on your podcast platform of choice. We're trying to continuously level up the show, and it lets us know that we're headed in the right direction when you do so. So without further ado, have a great rest of your day and see you next time.
Peace.